First of all, I just want to welcome you to our webinar series. And today we are going to be discussing supporting children in times of crisis. My name is Kelly Condon, and I'm with the Texas Oncology Foundation. And our foundation, for those who are new to our community, we are dedicated to providing support to cancer patients in the communities where they live, work, and receive treatment. Our Survive and Thrive programming that the foundation has is able to provide educational events and resources to both help build community connections and support all involved in the cancer journey. And so that's not only our survivors, but that is our caregivers and our healthcare providers and our families and loved ones, everyone involved with you in that journey. And one of my favorite things about Texas Oncology is that we are able to provide assistance in your actual communities. And so all the funds raised stayed in our Texas Oncology sites, and so that is just really encouraging, and I love that about this foundation. A few housekeeping for this Zoom platform for you in case you're new. Do not worry, we cannot see or hear any of our attendees. You can only see and hear us, so don't be worried about that. If you're having any technical difficulties, I have found that a good solution is typically just exiting and rejoining the webinar session will help fix any of those problems you're experiencing. Also, if you're experiencing audio issues, I found a great way to deal with those problems is to choose to dial in and listen from a phone. And on the registration confirmation email you received, there is a phone number for you in order to access this meeting. We encourage you to ask questions. There is a questions option. It says Q&A if you kind of hover at the bottom of your screen, I believe. And so if you have any questions or comments or thoughts for Dr. Zuniga as he is presenting, please share those for us. We are not going to pause his presentation to answer, but we will have a Q&A session at the end. So please keep them coming all throughout the presentation and know that we will discuss them at the end. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and the online archive will be available for viewing after this live version. The recording will be sent to everyone that has registered in follow-up emails, but you can also find it on our Texas Oncology Foundation website, which is texasoncologyfoundation.org. If you go to our programs tab along the top, and then on the left side, you'll see Survive and Thrive webinar archives, and that is where this can be found later. I am excited to have Dr. David Zuniga back with us today. He has just been such a valuable partner with our foundation. Dr. Zuniga is a licensed psychologist, and he practices in the Austin area. He focuses on mindfulness, spiritual counseling, grief, loss, and wellness. And Dr. Zuniga is also a father himself, so he is an excellent source for this topic. He has been navigating our current state in this whole year with his own children, just like the rest of us. So Dr. Zuniga, we are looking forward to hearing your insight, and we just appreciate you taking the time with us today.
Hey, Kelly, thank you so much. And I want to say thank you to everybody at Texas Oncology Foundation, and also thank you everybody for logging in with this webinar. I'm honored by your presence. And when Kelly and I were talking about putting this workshop together, one of the reasons I was so happy to do it, kind of like Kelly said, is I'm a parent myself, and I'm probably struggling. My wife and I are probably struggling as parents with the same things y'all are struggling with. So I'm really glad to be here and discussing this stuff with you today. Just to say quickly, I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I actually started my career. I went to Harvard Divinity School, studied comparative religion, and probably worked for about 15 years or so as an interfaith chaplain in palliative care, hospice care, and oncology with pediatric patients, children, and adults. So I've been supporting kids all my career, and I'm deeply honored to do this work. And now I'm a clinical psychologist, and I do a lot of spiritually integrative counseling, mindfulness-based counseling. And so we're kind of like Kelly said at the beginning, I'm going to speak for the first part of the presentation. We'll have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, and please submit your questions. And I'm just really, really honored to be here. And this topic is also near and dear to my heart. As I was saying, I've spent my entire career in either oncology, palliative care, or hospice care. And I'm a minister myself. And I do a lot of work in the community supporting people who have cancer, people who are terminally ill, also other chronic conditions. And so my kids have always kind of grown up around death and trauma. And one thing I definitely want to emphasize at the beginning of my talk is, of course, nobody wants to think about things like death, trauma, seminal life events, and these things are in the news. And kids, if you take nothing else from this talk, please take the fact that kids are way stronger and more resilient than we tend to think they are. Kids have an amazing potential for growth and strength, and our kids can emerge stronger and more psychologically whole as a result of this very, very scary pandemic. What's also true is, and I'm sharing a little bit of my personal experience, so I've worked around end of life and chronic healthcare issues my entire career. My kids have grown up in this field as well in some ways. And when the pandemic first started to really kind of dawn on our national consciousness in early March, when we started shutting down events, one of my daughters, I get up and go to work every day, Monday through Friday, to see my patients. And one of my daughters looked, and there was more and more stuff on the news about the novel coronavirus and it's spreading and all the kinds of, how do you go to the grocery store? How do you wash your hands properly? All this stuff became part of our common cultural discourse. And, one of my daughters, both their schools were moved online, and my wife was teaching. My wife is an elementary school teacher. She was teaching from home, and I was still going in to see my patients. And one morning, as I was getting ready to walk out the door, one of my daughters looked at me and she goes, "Dad, are you going to die because you're going to work?" And I don't work in an emergency room like I used to, but I share that with you all because this does feel different. This is a big deal, what's happening. And if you're a parent or if you're caring for children, families come. You're an uncle or an aunt and you're raising kids, or you're a teacher and you have kids in your life, or you're just wanting to support the kids in your life. This is very hard right now. And we as caregivers for children, family members with children in them, we need help too. And one of the most vulnerable feelings when you're a parent, when you're a healer, when you have kids in your life, is you want to do everything you can to protect those kids. And one of the hardest things is when we can't keep people safe, or we feel like we can't do something to help. And I do think with kids, and we're going to talk about this a lot today, there is a lot we can do to help. And another key point, if you take anything out of this talk today, please take this too. One of the most important things for being a caregiver or a parent raising children is self-care for yourself. And we say that a lot, and it's almost become passe or just kind of a cliche, like to talk about self-care. But it's not a cliche. It's not passe. It is life-giving, and it is life transforming. And in psychology, we often say there's no good clinical care without self-care. And that is really, really true. And it's also true of parenting or other forms of caring for children. So the first key takeaway that I cannot emphasize enough is your kids can be okay. Kids are a lot more resilient, a lot more resourceful, as adults we sometimes give them credit for, because we just want to protect them and love them. The second thing is some kind of self-care is non-negotiable. Maybe we need to be creative and flexible in how we do it. Maybe it doesn't look like it did it before because of physical distancing, this kind of stuff, but self-care is essential. When you provide some care for yourself, you're better able to take care of the kids in your life. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of my talk today, I'd like to offer a few more general thoughts about supporting kids during the pandemic. I'd like to spend some time talking about, because there's kind of a lot of myths about kids and how they think about death or trauma or life-changing events. And so I'd kind of like to try and get in the minds of kids a little bit for how they think about trauma, life-changing events, seminal events. Maybe talk a little bit about child development. I'd definitely like to spend some time talking about the media in general and the issue of screen time. Also talk a little bit about sleep and coping. And then if we have time, this is such a topic that's near and dear to my heart, but you know, some thoughts on sharing info about the pandemic with your kids. And then, you know, another topic that's near and dear to my heart is if you happen to lose, if your family happens to lose somebody right now during the pandemic, you know, and the truth is there are a lot of people who are dying nationwide and worldwide, you know, supporting kids and talking to kids about grief just in general. And of course, they're seeing things on the internet, TV, etc. So, but that's kind of a general overview of my talk. Again, I'll offer some more general thoughts on supporting kids during the pandemic, talking about how kids actually think about seminal, life-changing, or traumatic events, talk a little bit about childhood development, talk about the media and the issue of screen time, because of course, screens are ubiquitous in our society. They're everywhere, and parents are understandably frazzled these days, you know, having to burn the candle at both ends, and kids are online a lot, and so the issue of screen time is a real one. Also talk about sleep and coping, and then if we have time, talk about guidelines for sharing info and if someone you happen to know dies. And that's especially a relevant question for our audience. This is, of course, the Texas Oncology Foundation. This talk is open to the public, but I'm presuming that most people on this webinar are some way connected to the cancer community. Maybe you're a survivor, you're a cancer patient, you're a cancer caregiver, you know, a healthcare professional, but I'm assuming most people are cancer connected. And because of that, you know, being in infusion rooms, radiation, all the kind of stuff that cancer patients do, the population on this webinar is probably more likely to be dealing with end-of-life issues than the general populace. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to talk about today. It's an ambitious agenda, and I may talk a little quickly just because there's a lot of ground I want to cover, and then we'll also be respectful of your time, end on time, and then have some time for Q&A at the end. I do want to pose just kind of a thought experiment as we start and just offer an opening discussion question. People don't necessarily have to answer this, but you know, just kind of thinking, when you were a child, what was your earliest memory of someone dying or some kind of extreme trauma, a car accident, something really scary, or something really hard, or a huge change, like, you know, your mom or dad lost their job and, you know, we had to move to a different city or downsize from a house to an apartment, you know, some kind, you know, or a pet dying. A lot of times the first time we learn about death is through pets. What was that like for you as a child? How did the adults around you handle it? What was being told that this happened like for you? How did the adults handle things in general? And what was it like for you? What did the adults in your life do well? And what, if anything, do you wish the adults did differently? And the reason I like to pose that question is because as adults, you know, even before the pandemic, there was research that Americans are working more and more hours, burning the candle at both ends. And it can be easy to forget what it's like to be a kid. Kids are very resourceful, they're very intelligent, they're very creative, they can help us a lot too, they can be our teachers for sure, but it can be easy to forget what it's like to be a kid. And one of the single biggest things to supporting our kids is understanding our kids and understanding where our kids come from. So, and that's another key takeaway point of this talk, is that one of the single best things you can do for the kids in your life is, as much as possible, slow down when you can and try and get a really crystal clear understanding of what your kids are going through. You know, as much as we can, not making assumptions. And I say this myself as a parent because I can make assumptions too. But just really, really listening um, to what's going on with our kids, and making sure we have, as much as possible, a crystal clear understanding of what's going on with our kids. Excuse me. There's a great quote from Maya Angelou, which, to summarize, she basically says, people will forget what you say, they'll forget even what you may do, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And that's really, really true with our kids. Of course, we all make mistakes too, myself included, but there's no substitute for slowing down and just trying to get a clear understanding of what it's like for your child or children in the present moment. I do want to say too, just in some general notes about what we're going through, supporting our children and ourselves through the COVID-19 pandemic. We are living in traumatic times. And I mean that as a psychologist with like a capital T in the clinical sense, traumatic times. One thing we want to do, there's a saying in Asian philosophy, salvation lies in the middle way. We don't want to amplify the difficulty in our minds. We don't want to engage in catastrophic or black and white thinking. And we also don't want to be in avoidance or denial and minimize what's going on. As much as possible, we as caregivers for children want to see things directly and as accurately as possible. And it is okay to acknowledge the difficulty, including with the kids in our lives. We're in a worldwide pandemic. Something like this scale of a pandemic hasn't occurred for over 100 years. And we're sitting with a high degree of uncertainty right now. And I think that, kind of thinking about the kids in our lives and ourselves, there is a grief in our society right now. We're starting to open back up. Hopefully the economy picks back up, and there's not too much more suffering economically, but these are very uncertain times. And, you know, thinking about kids, my kids moved online. They moved spring break up and started early, which I think at first for the kids was a lot of fun, and then not so much fun. One of my daughters, little personal sharing, she just graduated from elementary school, and she did part of her graduation ceremony was online. And then part of it, they did what they called a drive-by graduation, which they, we got in the car, we drove through the school, teachers were on the sidelines cheering and waving placards and stuff, and our kids and they had like a little mini radio broadcast station for the school, and they said something nice about all the kids, and it was lovely as it could be. The teachers and administrators worked super hard, and it still wasn't the same, going to church, playing soccer, playing with the kids in the neighborhood, going to see a movie or an ice cream or go to a game store, whatever it is. Things, at least for now, have changed, and our kids pick up on that. Another key point is that kids are like sponges, or they're like radio towers reflecting the emotional valence in our homes and in our society. You can tell your kids everything's fine, but they're probably going to be able to see through that. And so kids are kind of experiencing things from all perspectives right now. All the stuff that's happening in our society. There's a lot of protests in our society. There's, some political discourse and debates in our society. Our kids are on the internet now more than ever before. Our kids know what's going on. One thing I do want to say too is that as parents, it's important to think about, and I say this as a parent myself, we all want our kids to be happy. We want our family time to be happy. We want the environments around our kids to be happy. And happiness is great. Certainly as a psychologist, I'm not putting off happiness. It is interesting to think about the question, and I'm thinking about this too for our kids and for our family structures. What do we mean by happiness in the first place? A lot of times when we use the term happiness, we mean things like sensory pleasures or kind of key moments like, oh, your kid scored the winning goal, or, your kid won the league championship or the spelling bee, or they got straight A's, or our team won the Super Bowl, or we got a big job promotion, something like that. All that's great. I'm not putting any of that down. Those two do tend to be kind of looking at life as kind of a peaks and a valleys perspective, highs and lows. not that that's bad, but if you look at a lot of cross-cultural research, many other citizens and other countries view the question of happiness or the purpose of life very differently. As quick examples, and I really enjoy cross-cultural research, if you ask Americans what they view as happiness, they'll give responses. Republicans, Democrats, rich, poor, Northerners, Southerners, Americans will often give responses like we just described: getting a promotion, getting a pay raise, getting a new job, getting a new house, a new car, your team winning the Super Bowl, these kind of peak moments. If you ask people in especially East Asia, but in other societies in general, they'll say things like being present, having gratitude. They'll talk about psychological internal states as ways of being, not external peaks and valleys, highs and lows. It's an interesting way of looking at what do we mean by happiness, you know? Or another kind of classic example, they were looking at Americans versus folks from East Asia, and it seems like an odd thought experiment in the moment, but it's actually quite revealing. If you have a big fish tank with lots of stuff in the fish tank, different fish, different things, Americans invariably will almost always point to the big fish, whereas people in East Asia will talk about the context, the background of the fish tank. And it is kind of interesting to think about how do we define happiness? How do we define why we're here? And the reason I offer that is because right now we're in a pandemic and we're trying to navigate this with our kids. There are changes economically that are happening right now, changes in our government that are happening right now, even changes in our neighborhoods and how we play with the kids and socialize with the other adults in our neighborhood. All of these things are changing right now. And so one way I think of things is not just in terms of happiness, but living a purposeful life. What is the purpose for why we're here? With a lot of my psychology clients, I even, it's kind of a classic existential therapy technique. I call it the death test. And one of the reasons I think I've spent my entire career working in oncology, chronic illness, and terminal illness, children and adults, is because the kind of work I do believe helps you see what's really important in life, what really matters in the end. And one of the things I often do with my therapy clients is I say, when you're looking back on the scope of your life, and this is something that a lot of cancer patients and cancer caregivers have to think about, what do you want the story of your life to be? What really matters in the end? What's really most important? And then how are we living our lives? Now, we all need downtime, we all need to rest, but the central question is, how do we want to define ourselves? What do we want the story of our life to be? And I think that's a good thing to think about right now during the pandemic, for yourself and for your family. When this pandemic first happened, I sat down first with my wife, and then we did a family meeting, and we said, okay, we're in this pandemic, there's all this physical distancing. What is most important to us, like individually? And we discussed all that and put it on a whiteboard as a family, you know, and what's important as a family. How do we navigate this time? You know, I do believe, as hard as this is, we will get through this sooner or later. Most generations have something that is a seminal challenge. You know, if you look back on the United States, we had World War I, and that was horrific. We had the Great Depression. It lasted for a very long time. World War II, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Cold War. There are often seminal life-changing events that define a particular generation of people, and we get through them. Humanity endures and continues to grow. We will get through this, but when we look back on this time, what do we want this time to represent? What are the most important things? And as a parent, what is most important for your kids? What is most important for your family? Again, I do think I want to emphasize when I'm talking, sometimes I'll use the term parent, but I'm trying to use the term parent generically. Families come in all shapes and sizes, and families can be equally high functioning, 2 moms, 2 dads, 1 dad, 1 mom, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle raising kids. Families come in all shapes and sizes, and are all equally good. You know, one thing too is this is the Texas Oncology Foundation. I'm again assuming primarily our audience is part of the cancer community, the survivor community. And in a way, that does give you all a leg up on the general population. On the one hand, you've been through a lot, and maybe you're going through a lot right now. Like, it's hard to have cancer. It's hard to have cancer during a pandemic, and that brings all kinds of complications, which is another talk. But also, difficulty can make us more resilient. It can help us dig deeper into our psyche to come up with new coping mechanisms, new cognitive schemas, new behaviors, new interpersonal patterns to live as fully as we can possibly live. Everybody on this call, or most folks on this call, are connected to the cancer community. You've already had a master's degree in coping. You've already learned quite a great deal about what works or doesn't work for you in great difficulty. And so as you're thinking about supporting the kids in your life, kind of reflect back on what was most helpful to you and your family when you were going through other very traumatic, difficult times, and then integrate that now. You know, it's interesting. The studies show that adults usually do not engage in open, candid conversations about things like trauma or death or life-changing events with children. And I think the difficulty in talking to children about COVID-19 related issues is increased because understandably, we as adults have our own difficulty in thinking about things related to the pandemic, you know, finances, job securities, even sometimes food shortages, these kind of things. So the internal stress we feel can impact how we take care of our kids. Thinking about some of the other challenges we face in talking to kids. I'm not Freudian. A little side note about psychology, there's actually over 400 different styles of counseling. Psychology, in some ways, is kind of like religion in that there's all kinds of different denominations, if you will. I'm not Freudian, but every so often Sigmund Freud, I do think, got something right. And Freud once suggested that because adults have lost their own childhood innocence, I want to come back to this point later on. Freud said that because adults have lost their own childhood innocence, they want to believe that children live in an idealized world free of pain. And of course we have good hearts. We want our kids to live in an idealized world free of pain because we just love them and we want them to have that kind of life. But difficulty can make us stronger and more resilient. Our kids are stronger and more resilient than we often realize. And interestingly, Freud hypothesized that because of this dynamic between adults and kids, that adults have lost their own childhood innocence. And Freud talked a lot, and I do think he was right on this, on how we can be very death-denying ourselves on an individual level and on a society. And then we can pass on, if we're not careful, something to watch for, we can pass on dysfunctional attitudes about death and trauma and difficulty to our kids. One quick example from cancer research, there was a study done looking at kids who were on inpatient oncology floor, and kids would often realize, children who are oncology patients would often realize they were on the last drug that they could try before anyone else said anything to them. And kind of what that suggests is that children notice when adults and medical staff start to treat them differently. In other words, kids pick up on things long before we may think they do. Our tone of our voice, our eye contact, our body language, our mannerisms. Kids just pick up on things way more than we realize. And that's probably especially true being on kind of, physical distancing right now where everybody's in the home 24/7. So just kind of like other topics that adults find hard to discuss with children, one way or another, the children in our lives will learn about COVID-19. And this, especially when there's things like trauma or life-changing moments, those can often become lifelong memories for kids. It's important to remember too that different members of a family will, or different children in a group will hold different feelings about death. Thus, the same death or life-changing event will impact children differently. And I also think it can be helpful to have an understanding of how the entire family functions together, to understand how an individual child will react. Children and adults can influence and teach each other. And again, kids are a lot stronger and more resilient than we think. I do think that we're living in traumatic times right now. And what I mean by that is when essentially the clinical definition of trauma is something life-threatening or severe happens to you or someone you care about or someone you witness. It doesn't have to be directly to you. And then some of the things you may experience as a result of that are heightened anxiety or depression, avoidance, like wanting to avoid memories of that, and also kind of numbing, and also re-experiencing that trauma over and over again. Flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive memories and thoughts, that kind of thing. And if you think about the clinical definition of trauma, I think it's a fair statement to say that we're living in traumatic times right now. The reason I say all that is because, so we talk a lot about post-traumatic stress, which is a good thing to talk about. Trauma is more common than we realize. But also, there's also a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth. And it's interesting that we talk about post-traumatic stress so often, but we talk about post-traumatic stress less often. We talk about post-traumatic stress all the time. We talk about post-traumatic growth much less often. And interestingly, post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth happen at about the same rates. The biggest predictors for post-traumatic growth are the innate coping mechanisms that people have, and if they get good support. If people get good support and they already have good coping mechanisms in place, they're less likely to have post-traumatic stress. So that's all to say, again, that kids can emerge from this very traumatic and difficult time more whole, more self-actualized, more psychologically resilient, and with an abundance of these kind of traits that we talk about in positive psychology: equanimity, acceptance, mindfulness, presence, gratitude, maturity, self-individuation. We can emerge, and a lot of people in the cancer community have already experienced this directly, we can emerge from great trauma and difficulty more psychologically whole and resilient. I do want to talk a little bit about, too, how children actually think about seminal life-changing events, traumatic events, death-related events, grief, because these things are happening right now. I think as of this morning, over 111,000 Americans have died of COVID-19, and we have more cases than any other country in the world right now. And so these things are definitely in the news. And I do want to, and that can be scary as caregivers for children, because we want to protect kids. But I also want to, hopefully this is actually a kind of paradoxical ray of light for all of you. Interestingly, the research consistently demonstrates that even very young children, and I mean children like 18 months old-ish, tend to think about things like death, trauma, or life-changing events. An 18-month-old may not have object permanence all the time and may not always retain that information, but you take a kid to the park and they see a dead bird, or mom or dad is cutting the grass and they go over a cricket or a bug or something like that, or a worm in the driveway that gets run over. Death is a part of life. Change is a part of life. Nature is one way to kind of gently integrate these realities into our kids' lives. And kids think about this stuff way before the pandemic occurred. And these kind of life-changing events, traumatic feeling events, can often be the earliest memories that adults have. And I bet if we had more time and kind of put a question out to the audience, I bet a lot of you, if you think about your earliest event, it might be a dog dying or, a grandparent dying, something like this. Kids are already exposed to a microcosm of what the pandemic represents. And a lot of times the explanations that adults provide about these kind of seminal life-changing events, if we're not careful, we might slip into overgeneralizations or be overly sentimental and not acknowledge the reality of the situation. Childhood experiences of things like trauma or life-changing events can influence how we view those same phenomenon when we become adults. And even if, millions of Americans right now are unemployed, and it's tough to shelter at home, even if your job is safe, even if your income is okay, even if all those things are true, just the fact that we're in a time of social upheaval, that other people are having great suffering and difficulty, can be hard for you and can be hard for the kids in your life. One thing to think about too as you're trying to support your kids, kids often learn about things like life-changing events, trauma, great difficulty through play. As one of my favorite examples, probably everybody on this call knows the popular song and game Ring Around the Rosies. Well, interestingly, that became popular during a plague in the 14th century in Europe. Kids play games or card games like War. They play with G.I. Joe figures, video games. Kids learn about, death and trauma just through play, and that can actually be quite natural and help them to integrate coping mechanisms and learn to think about these very challenging things. Sometimes kids may be hesitant to share their fears because they actually want to protect their parents and siblings, which is one reason why it's important to have open and honest communication about this kind of stuff. Interestingly, children will sometimes even assume a parental role, shielding and even comforting their parents or siblings in their life, or vice versa. Sometimes we can overshield our kids, and so let's just be aware of the kind of communication. We're going to talk about communication more in just a second. But one thing we want to strive for is making sure we understand what our kids are feeling, making sure we understand what they're asking, and then providing them what they want in an age-appropriate way. And we'll talk about this more in just a second, but also making sure that they actually understand what we're saying and talking about, because we can say one thing and then for whatever reason they may hear something different. That's true for adults. The kind of issues that a pandemic raises are scary and hard to conceptualize for adults. So they're also scary and hard to conceptualize for kids. So another great question is to ask the kids in our life, hey, I just want to make sure I'm speaking clearly. What are you hearing from me right now? Or how does it feel to be talking about this kind of stuff? In terms of child development, again, the more an adult can understand what a child is thinking and feeling, the more that helps. Research consistently reveals patterns in children's developmental understandings of life-changing events and trauma. As we said earlier, children can become aware of things like death, trauma early on, and as parents, we can do a lot to help. Understanding kind of great difficulty, life-changing events can actually, the understanding children have will improve as they get older, and it can actually help them become more mature. One thing to keep in mind for kids during the pandemic is that when children are younger, they do not initially see death as a universal, unavoidable, permanent thing. Initially, they see and experience death as more of a separation, more temporary. Sometimes in hospice, we referred to it as, quote, the Roadrunner Syndrome, kind of like those old cartoons where the Roadrunner would get hit by an anvil and then he jumps up and, keeps chasing the other cartoon animals, and so when we think about, the pandemic and people having to wear masks or face shield or washing our hands for 2 happy birthdays or physical distancing and, doing virtual hugs, not real hugs. This stuff is hard for kids to understand. I do want to say, too, that though there are some general observable trends in understanding how kids approach things like loss, trauma, life-changing events, all children, even in the exact same age range, don't experience these things in the same way. Every child is unique, and so you want to, as much as you can, always be understanding where your kids are at in the present moment. In general, when it comes to things like loss, trauma, grief during a pandemic, the younger the child, the more they tend to express anxiety about separation. The older the child, the more troubled they will be about other dimensions of death. And the older children get, like when they're teenager, the more their kind of cognitive schemas and coping mechanisms and kind of automatic thoughts will become more adult-like. Children who are older are more likely to convey death as being terrible or being frightening. Our culture, spirituality, these things can all serve as, media can serve as powerful influences on how children relate to death, trauma, life-changing events. And then also, when we think about these things in relation to supporting the kids in our family, it's good to think not just about developmental understandings of death, but the roles our children have within our family as a whole. Are they the oldest? Are they the middle child? Are they the youngest? Are they protectors? Are they the strong and brave one? Are they the introverted one? What kind of roles do the kids in our family have within the family structure and even within the children's structure, the substructure of just children within the family? For example, families who have cancer see this all the time. Let's say you have 3 siblings. Let's say the oldest child develops cancer. Maybe the oldest child was kind of a deputy parent, or, helped enforce rules, or was, behaved well so everybody else would also go brush their teeth, whatever it is. Then the oldest child gets cancer. It does shift in a complicated and emotional way the roles that each of the children in the family have. And so think about that kind of stuff during the pandemic can be helpful. One other thing to keep in mind with children's development is that children may regress during the pandemic. And that's often true when there's trauma, big seminal changes in a kid's life. They may regress and act even younger than they are. Things like sleep can be thrown off. Our children can also want to be physically closer, and that can be another tough dynamic to manage with families, because a lot of families are working from home these days, and so you can be kind of on top of each other 24/7. One thing we do with our kids, because my wife is a teacher and I'm a psychologist, I actually moved my entire practice online, at least for right now. So the kids right now are on summer vacation, but the kids are at home. They're doing school from home. So everybody's on home 24/7. It's definitely a change in our family life. One thing is we put up our schedules for the day and the week, so everybody has access to that. Everybody can get some time by themselves. And also we'll make sure that the kind of dyads within our family, like my wife and I, our anniversary is tonight, believe it or not. So we're going to have a little couple time, mom and dad time, which is good for the kids to see that. They learn about relationships through their parents. The kids will get just, sister time or that kind of thing. I do want to want to leave time for question and answers, but I do want to say a little bit about screen time, because that's a big one that comes up, or media in general. The media can kind of be your friend or a challenge when we're thinking about the pandemic. There are, some very serious images that kids are seeing on the news. Myself, and I've worked in oncology or palliative care, hospice care for over 20 years. And, when the pandemic was really exploding in New York City and New York State, I was just surfing the internet like everybody else does, and I saw images of mass graves in New York City. And even though I've worked in end-of-life issues my entire life, I found that shocking and traumatic to look at. Our kids may be seeing shocking and traumatic things too. There was a study done, I guess back in the 80s, that said that just kids watching the evening news, movies, television shows, cop shows, war movies, this kind of stuff, that by the time the average American child had reached age 18, they had seen over 1 million deaths on television screens. And so what is that like now in the age of the internet and YouTube and social media? One other study I always come back to about the media is researchers studying death and how it's portrayed in Disney movies. And Disney movies are definitely, I think Disney owns Pixar too, like huge in shaping our kids. And I'm quoting from the article, I pulled this up. The trend in Disney films to vilify the antagonist to a point where they are seen as deserving their deaths. All unjustified deaths were those of protagonists, showing the good characters never deserve to die. So, we think about things like The Lion King or the movie Up, which a lot of kids have seen, or Bambi's mother getting killed. Disney movies, and this is just one example, but it's emblematic of the media. Death is often portrayed as either deserved because the character's a bad person, or undeserved because they're good. And it is worth thinking about what kind of media are our kids consuming, and what is that teaching our kids about coping and just life in general. I will offer a quick thought too on screen time. I think the basic thing is we all get concerned about our kids being on screens too much, but in general, unless media screen time is getting in the way of, their sleep, their exercise, socializing with the family or other important things, unless it's kind of really getting in a way with basic functioning, I wouldn't worry so much about screen time right now. Screen time can also actually be communal sometimes, and it can be a great learning thing. But especially during the pandemic, if your kids are getting a lot of screen time, I think they'll still be okay. I do want to take some time. We could maybe talk a little more about screen time. We could also talk about sleep or some more ideas about coping, but I want to be mindful of our time. This is one of my favorite topics, so I could talk all day, but I want to also open it up to question and answers right now.
Awesome. Yeah, I encourage everybody, we are going to spend a few moments doing some Q&A, and some good comments have already come through. So use that Q&A tab on your screen to send us in your thoughts and questions. Dr. Zuniga, first of all, happy anniversary. Thanks for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Well, families are important to me, so I'm glad we're doing this with Texas Oncology.
Yeah, we appreciate it. So this kind of goes hand in hand with that screen time that you were just talking about. So I'll start off with this question.
Yeah.
But some comments came through about, having conflicts, and some of the kids are using this time of, this is all just so hard, so I shouldn't have to do chores, or I don't need limits on my screen time. And so what do you have to offer is just, how do we manage this? Is a change, so how do we balance, we don't want to, break the given or, whatever standards we'd set previously to this, but how do you manage that right now?
Yeah, So I am interested in a lot in Asian philosophy, and so one of my guides for life is and clinical work is salvation lies in the middle way, kind of like we said earlier. We do need to have some flexibility because this is unprecedented times. We're at home a lot more. It is stressful, and you know, the other thing is, as a quick example, the human adult brain weighs an average of 2 to 3 pounds, and yet it consumes over 20% of our calories. That's extraordinary. Something that only weighs 2 to 3 pounds burns over 20% of your energy in your body. Amazing. So that is just to say that we're living in stressful times. You know, even if your family's jobs are secure, and I hope they are, and you're not taking a pay cut or getting furloughed, if you're able to shelter at home and, you know, keep yourself as safe as possible. And of course, cancer patients can be at a higher risk, or cancer survivors, for getting COVID-19. These are just stressful times. So that's all to say that we need to be gentle with ourselves. I mean, even good change can be hard. And, you know, if you know, and I have to say this for myself, is the house is a little messier, you know, whatever it is, that's okay. If your haircut isn't usually what it is, that's okay. We need to be gentle with ourselves. And so if you have your kids having a little more screen time, fine. You know, if we maybe ease up on, just as adults, you know, if we ease up on ourselves, we can ease up on our kids as well. At the same time, you know, parents learn about boundaries from kids in the family system, and kids also feel secure when there is a structure in place. And, you know, we don't want to be authoritarian as parents, and we also don't want to be passive. We want to have a healthy, assertive attitude, not aggressive, not passive. And kids will feel safe and secure when adults are confident, you know, and adults say, I've got this. Like when your physician or your psychologist you're like, I'm having panic attacks. Okay, we can deal with this. I have cancer. I have a treatment plan. Same in the family system. If parents project some confidence, and yes, we need to, you know, still walk the dog in the backyard, or, you know, whatever it is, take out the trash, that kind of structure and consistency. Even if our kids sometimes complain, say that from personal experience, it can actually be quite comforting to kids. And having a routine and a ritual and as much normalcy as possible during uncertain and changing times is actually a good thing. So I would say my shorter answer is you want a middle way approach. Some structure, some consistency is a very, very good thing. Great question, Kelly.
Yeah. And then kind of, I guess, a sub question of that, kind of looking at the emotional state of kids. A comment came in that the parent had previously had cancer the year before, and so the kid is, you know, dealing with all those emotions if they've had to walk through that, and now it's this pandemic and just our current situation. So how do we just help support our kids' emotional states through this?
It's such a great question, and I love this topic so much. What I would more than one thing is true. On the one hand, it's okay to cry. It's okay to cry with your kids. In fact, that's actually one of the best gifts that you can give them, either holding them, comforting them, normalizing the sadness experience, or even crying in front of your kids. That's okay. Because kind of like we were saying earlier, kids are smarter than we often realize. They pick up on more than we want, and they're going to pick up on stuff. And so a lot of times what happens is we're like, I'm okay, everything's fine. And the kids, they know it's not fine. But then they're getting the message subtly that it's not okay to talk about these things, or it's not okay to talk about certain feelings, or, you know, being strong means you don't feel things, which is actually the exact opposite. If you suppress things, if you keep them in, well, you're probably going to have insomnia or high blood pressure or anger management, or, you know, whatever is going on. If we let these things out in healthy ways, then we don't get stuck in them as easily. So it's okay to talk about sadness. It's okay to share sad feelings. It's okay to have a good cry and to let those emotions out. With kids too, and then you're giving healthy modeling for kids. Like, we all get sad sometimes, and we can overcome that sadness. We definitely hold stress and tension and trauma in our bodies. So as much as possible, one of my daughters takes boxing lessons. It was before the pandemic. Now they're on YouTube, they're streamed, but still good, you know, and we'll whip out a, you know, we have a punching bag that will inflate, and we can put it up, and, you know, I'll put on some heavy metal music from the 80s. The kids will hit the punching bag. Honestly, it's probably some of the best medicine we can get. You know, playing more board games as a family, what are called role play games, where, you know, children, like Dungeons and Dragons, you know, can engage in therapy play and work on interpersonal skills, watching media together and talking about it as a family. Certainly physical types of play are very good things. Making sure you get outside. Another technique I like, two more techniques I like. One is, I'm a big believer in drawing your feelings. Adult coloring books are also a thing now, you know.
Yes.
You're coloring, you're using the visual cortex and the occipital lobe of your brain. You're not, you know, activating your amygdala, for example. You know, coloring can be a form of self-regulation using art. Another big thing for kids is teaching them emotional regulation skills, distress tolerance skills. Kids can meditate. I'm certified in mindfulness-based stress reduction. Kids can be better meditators than kids, or kids can be better meditators than adults. Sorry, I'm so excited. I'm trying to talk fast, but kids can be better meditators than adults. You know, learning to slow down, pay attention to their breath, slow their brain and body down. Before I went to divinity school, I actually taught in a prison for a while. Kids can be great meditators. All kinds of kids can learn meditation. Some good apps for kids are Calm is a good one. Headspace is a good one. Cosmic Kids. My daughter described it as a YouTube channel for yoga and meditation, but those are three good ones. Calm, Headspace, Cosmic Kids. Another good one for adults, or I'm sorry, for children, is there's a book series called the Moody Cow series. It's a whole series books. Don't we all feel like moody cows? And it's designed for kind of lower elementary children, but honestly, it can be good for upper elementary children or adults. And I will say too, as a quick resource, I try to make my website a free community resource for the oncology community, families, kids, intersection of spirituality and psychology. My website was probably on the flyer, but it's Dr. David Zuniga, all one word, Dr. for Dr. David, and my last name Zuniga, Zuniga.com. I even have original free videos of guided meditation up there. There's a lot of good resources out there for kids. Meditation, somatic quieting. Again, some of the apps I like for kids: Calm, Headspace, Cosmic Cows. But yeah, good question.
Yeah. And then these two kind of came in when you were talking about regression and separation anxiety, and people are just wanting to know, do you have ideas that you can share for handling both if your kid's experiencing regression and separation anxiety?
Yeah, one thing is, some regression is normal and understandable. Adults do that too. And I will say, with separation anxiety, it may be good to think about counseling sometimes. One benefit of the pandemic is a lot of psychotherapy has moved online. So counseling is and insurance is now paying for teletherapy. And so counseling is kind of more accessible than ever before, which is a good thing. I do think one of the big things, this also gets into the idea of sleep, separation anxiety. Kids can have separation anxiety around sleep. I do think having as much of a structure as possible while having some flexibility can be good. I do think too, really tuning into hearing about what's upsetting your kids will be helpful. You do want to make sure, maybe even depending on what's going on with your kids, like if it's separation anxiety around sleep, maybe doing a telehealth appointment with your pediatrician to make sure there's no underlying health issues. I do think you want to focus on validating their feelings. I'm trying to go very quickly. And also focus on what I'll take 30 seconds. Also focus on what we call cognitive reframing, telling a different story. Like if a child can say, I'm alone, okay, maybe that's true, or maybe it's not, versus I'm independent, or my parents are just down the hall. I'm getting some alone time to have my own adventures, but kind of focusing on cognitive reframing what's going on. Again, helping with things like meditation, self-soothing, emotional regulation. Another thing I do with my kids is I'll kind of say like, okay, dad has to go to work for a couple hours, and then we'll play Dungeons and Dragons, which we do, by the way. But you kind of you give your kids dad, mom's going to do this for 2 hours, and then we'll do this as a family, and also kind of positive rewards and behavioral shaping. Hey, when you guys stayed off the internet so dad could do his webinar with Texas Oncology, it was really helpful to me.
Yes, we appreciate that.
So one of the biggest things you can do in shaping your kids compassionately is catch them doing things right and then rewarding that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great
Awesome.
question.
And then there is one more. I do want to be mindful of time, but I think this is just a great question to end on. And I'm going to kind of combine two, actually. But school's over. We're now transitioning into the summertime. Our kids don't have that school time occupying a good majority of their day. Some of the usual activities that they do in the summers aren't happening this year.
Right.
So what do you have any resources or suggestions you have for, how do we entertain our kids if, we're still quarantined, not all of our community is open back up? And then kind of a sub question in that, what if our kids are only children and they haven't been having that personal time with other kids to play, and they have FaceTime play dates, but it's just not the same as in person. So just any resources to entertain our kids during this time.
Right. One thing I think to emphasize with kids is to be straight up. Again, can't emphasize that enough. And one message I try to give my kids is, hey, this is hard. It's frustrating. And we will get through this, which I do believe. And it's tough for the oncology community because cancer patients and, cancer families, we can have compromised immune systems. So the pandemic can be a particular worry. I mean, you might want to consider, and I'm not an epidemiologist, but are there ways you can venture out a little more safely? Like you go to a public park, which is outdoors and way less likely towards transmission. Everybody wears masks. Maybe you even want to wear a face shield, take hand sanitizer along, and can you go to the park? One of my daughters is really into soccer, and going to the park and kicking a soccer ball is her nirvana these days. And I do think there's a way with kids that we can tap into, learning to appreciate the smaller things in life can be a godsend.
Mm-hmm.
I do think too that there are a lot of good things, summer camps. Little personal sharing, my kids play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, which is great for psychological development. Dungeons and Dragons has moved online. One of my kids does karate. One of my kids does boxing. Boxing and karate lessons have moved online. Musical groups are doing concerts online. It's not the same, but it can get us through this difficult period. Another thing we do is we'll play, one of my favorite things for kids is a game called the Ungame, where it's not competitive. You just move around a colorful board and talk about your thoughts and feelings and experiences, and we can play the Ungame via Zoom with grandparents on the other side of the country. So paradoxically, even though we're in a pandemic, we actually get to see some people more. But those are some of the things I'd look for.
Well, yeah, we're going to wrap up this time. Dr. Zuniga, thank you for your time and just sharing with us. And we are just so appreciative of everybody that attended today. I just want to encourage everybody to stay connected with our foundation. Like us on Facebook, follow us there, visit our website for more resources. We are continuing these Survive and Thrive webinars. And in fact, our next live session is June 30th, and Justin and Katie Ozuna are going to be with us and discussing around the topic of working together through adversity. And then also, go to our Facebook page. So much of our resources are being shared and posted there. And we've been doing a lot more live watch parties. Dr. Zuniga led a guided meditation session for us last week on June 4th. And so that video is still accessible. And then have scheduled for June 25th a laughter yoga session that'll be live on our Facebook page. And I also want to say, Dr. Zuniga mentioned his website and things. And so if you're looking for that, posts leading up to this, I have been linking to his Facebook page. So if you need help finding that, you can look on our Facebook page as well. And then just a reminder, this session was recorded and it will be shared with all of you that registered. Also in that email for all who attended, there is going to be a survey link, and we just would love your feedback. We want to know what's working for you, what's not, how we can improve these webinar series. So please provide us your insights and your feedbacks. And thank you again, Dr. Zuniga. This was so wonderful.
Thank you very much. And thanks for everybody tuning in to the Texas Oncology Foundation and you, Kelly, for making this happen. Thank you very much. Stay safe.
You too. Everyone have a great day.